Hi there, welcome to an episode of Fair Roundup. I'm your host today, Carl Mungazi. I'm joined by Paige.
Hey everybody.
Awesome. And our guest today is Dana Yudelevich.
Hello.
Cool. So Dana, would you mind telling us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yes, so I'm a senior front-end developer and I've been a front-end developer for the past 10 years. I'm actually originally from Israel. Right now I live in Las Vegas, but I've worked in many Israeli startups, big and small, and one of the more notable is Fiverr. And there I actually helped introduce React into their code base, which they now use all over, which is awesome. And I'm part of an Israeli women in tech group called Vaot, and I give talks there and mentor other women. And also I mentor students at Punch Code, which is a nonprofit tech school. Love that. And I have a technical blog on Medium. Yeah, just love React, love web development. Been doing that for so long and hope to be doing that for even longer.
Awesome.
Leveling up is important. I spend at least an hour every day learning ways I can improve my business or take a break and listen to a good book. If you're looking to level up, I recommend you start out with the 12-week year as a system to plan out where you want to end up and how to get the results you want. You can get it free by going to audibletrial.com/code. That's audibletrial.com/code.
So Dana, How did you get into React in particular?
So I got into React when I was at Fiverr. We were very much looking for a way to reuse code and actually create components. We were very much using like vanilla JS and jQuery back at that point. And even I think it was handlebars and kind of, very old school templating. And we were really looking for a way to kick it up a notch. And it was when React really started, being more prominent. I think it just kind of came out. And we were definitely at Fiverr wanted to be on top of the, top-notch technology and be at the front. So we definitely started looking into React and we started, introducing it to a few projects. And I slowly introduced it to the other team members and we loved it. We started migrating our code base slowly to React. And then we actually created a component library, which is what I'm here today to talk about, and which presented a lot of challenges in itself as to how to build it correctly. And, we were also planning to release it open source, which also adds another dimension of challenges. Yeah. And we very much like React. And then after I left Fiverr, I got into more startups that use React. And I wanted to stay with React because I very much liked the way that they construct the whole architecture. And I really enjoyed the concept of hooks that was being added. And yeah, so I'm very much working with React for a long time now. And I am also in Fiverr, we use Redux to manage the state. And now more of a Mobex kind of gal, but both are good. So yeah.
So you said that you kind of started designing your own component library. I'm really curious how you go about that or how you guys approached it, because I've used component libraries and, they're super helpful, really useful, but I can't imagine being the people like making the decisions of how to build it. And I'm really curious of how you guys approached it.
Yeah. So the first thing I think you start thinking about when you're thinking about a component library is like, why not use an existing one, right? Like Material UI or Design or something like that. Like, why reinvent the wheel, right? So there are, of course, a lot of advantages to using those libraries, but there are also disadvantages. First being that they enforce their own APIs and their own types and their own, logic and theming, right? And it can be a bit tricky to customize. From my own experience with Material UI, I love Material UI. First of all, I love it, but it can be like a learning curve to, handle their theming and all of that. And I also think it does limit the design aspect, because as much as you customize it, it's gonna still be Material UI, and it would constrict your designers from making super custom stuff. You are still limited to that library, and it does also sometimes send you down the rabbit hole of understanding exactly which type each component is looking for. So it's like someone else defined that for you, and it's not something that you customize to your needs. And I think there are a lot of advantages, of course, like they do handle all of the edge cases, all of the platforms, devices, accessibility, things that you might not even be aware aware of that since it is, it's a community that's working on a, such a big project, and they had so much time to think of all those scenarios, they already solved that for you. So there are a lot of advantages for that. But I think especially what I saw from working with both at companies that built their own libraries like Fiverr, and I worked in another startup that based on Material UI and build components over that. I feel like you might start up by saying, yeah, I want to get set up quickly. Let's just use an existing library. And in the future, we might create our own components and slowly migrate. But you end up committing to it for the long run, because once you build, your foundation with those libraries, it's very hard to wean off of it. It's like it becomes a whole project just to, disconnect from that, from that base. At the startup I worked at, Stream Elements, we started using Material UI, because it's a young startup. We wanted to get up and running quickly, but we got to a point where we were very much dependent on Material UI. And when we wanted to customize things further, we then started to understand that we need to slowly get off of Material UI and start creating our own components. And it became like this whole thing where you need to dedicate time to that. So it may be, faster at the beginning, but later it might create some issues. So it's just something to be aware of. And I think when you have a component library that's internal, first of all, you're building it, of course, for the end users, right? It needs to be good UI, but you're also building it for your other developers on your team to use, which is an important point to keep in mind. So it needs to be very, clear, usable, and very much to your needs. I think something that people often forget is that we're also building that component library for the designers, because they would create those components and they would comprise their designs from those components, right? So they would use that component library across the site. So we would want to build that in a way that incorporates the designers into the process. So I do think having an inner component library it does provide improved speed of development. So people might think it might slow down development to start making, components that are reusable instead of just going at it and doing quick and dirty work. But in the long run, when you have a toolkit of components that you can reuse, it becomes so fast to just push out, grids and layouts just very quickly, because you know the components that you have a toolkit, you just use it, someone built it for you, even if it was you. And yeah, it makes things very fast. And I think another advantage is it's an advantage and a disadvantage where you can very much easily deploy changes app wide, right? Because if you're reusing the same components and you can make that change once in that component library, it just flows over to your app. But like the only thing is that it also means app-wide bugs, because if you if you make a mistake in that component, all your app is going to suffer from that, because reusability. And of course, we have the issue. It's not an issue. It's like something that we need to be aware of, which is UI consistency. We want the components to look the same. And if we start building, custom cases for each page and start changing it for each scenario and each layout, it's going to be inconsistent. So once we have that library, which is consistent on its own and consistent across the library, then everything looks better. And I think from my experience, for newcomers that are joining your team, it's much easier to start using a library. Like you can just go over it, tell them, look, we have a button, we have an input, we have our own little component library you can use. And usually it's like, oh, that's so nice. That it makes stuff so much easier and faster. So of course, there are also issues. I think it may feel like, it could slow down development, but I think when you develop and you start thinking about breaking it down into components and really taking the time to make those components reusable, it can feel like it's slowing you down. But I think, as I said, overall, it would be faster. And I think another issue is maintaining it without creating breaking changes, because, you would use this library probably across the app, across different different repos, across packages. And, you have that issue of if you're making a change, you need to make sure you're not breaking any usage, you're backwards compatible. And we have the issue, of course, of testing it and managing the versions, which is a headache. And I think it also could feel like you're being limited to the components that you've built. Like you might say, oh, the designer made it this way, but our component acts that way. So I'll just do that way, which could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. It depends on the culture, and the end goal, but it could be an issue. And of course, the issue of, what I talked about with the existing libraries, which they handle mobile web and accessibility and all of that, it would be very easy to miss those things because, you're not spending as much time on each component thinking of all the possible scenarios for that.
Yeah, I mean, what you said actually is something I've experienced in my kind of career so far. In each place I've worked, I've never actually used, let's say, an design or UI. We've always built our own components, and it's been faster because we know the code.
Yeah.
So if there's an issue with maybe how it's behaving in a particular place, we know how to go to the source code and look at it. But one thing I've always struggled with is knowing or deciding, okay, I can build my own dropdown, or I can import a dropdown from somewhere else and modify it, but maybe the button is ours, the input is ours, So how do you think about that? Do you go for an approach where every component is built in-house, or you might have, let's say, 80% in-house and 20% are like one or two libraries you've taken off the shelf because they have more features that you want to use?
Yeah, so I'm very much in general against reinventing the wheel. So as I said, we want to move fast. I do think that for more complex components like date pickers and, drop downs and stuff like that, it's totally fine to use imported packages, existing packages that, have been tested, and, you can customize it. You can, sit with your designer, show them the package, see if they, like the look and feel. I usually send a designer, hey, there's this kind of date picker. What do you think about that? And it can shorten, development time from creating such a custom component. But, the more atomic components definitely can be, as you said, most of it can be stuff that you do on your own. So yeah, I very much experienced that also in my day-to-day. We, a lot of time when there's more specific components that have a very familiar UI for the users, I sometimes would rather import an existing component and use that. And maybe in the future, customize it, but I think it's totally fine to use an importing component for sure.
And with that, how do you find the maintenance burden? Because that's one thing I find as well is once you've built it, you have to keep it going. So like right now, we are currently at now work, we're building a kind of a migration, and part of that we built new components in React, right? So we started off like, oh cool, buttons, inputs, text fields, but then we've now got so many features coming across the line. Like, okay, cool. This button is not quite the same as it was when we first started. So how do you kind of manage the time to actually say, okay, let's say in a sprint, you've got to work on a new feature. We're going to dedicate this time in this sprint to maybe maintain the components. Otherwise, after a while, they begin to get out of hand.
Yeah. So I think how I usually work and how I find it, the best kind of process of building the actual library out is when, you have a sprint, you have features that you're working on. And when I get to that technical design of a feature, I try to identify those components that as I build them, I could say those could be reusable across the platform. So other people would use this button that they could use this, select box. So I try to, identify those ahead of time and dedicate a bit more time to just build them out inside the component library and not just, in that isolated case. And I think it also makes sense to, as you, work on your feature, to identify existing components that you would want to use that someone else built and, extract those into the component library. Because sometimes, you're working on a feature and then you're saying, this component actually somebody already created that on that page. So maybe I should just extract that to a reusable component and use that instead of just duplicating code, which is, not the best practice. So when you identify those code reuse and code duplication, it's a sign that, you could reuse that as an abstracted component, as a reusable component. And I think that the main issue of maintaining that component library, I think the main issue is when you create a package, an NPM package, and And then things start getting rough because when you test it, you need to put out test versions and you need to work with NPM links. Sometimes it depends on how you work. If you work with Yarn workspaces or, there are several tools to manage it. But if you're working it with an external package, it can be an issue to maintain. And you need to, keep the versions across all of your repos, aligned, which is an issue. There are solutions for that. There's Greenkeeper, which is, I think, now called SNCC. And it's a tool that just opens PRs for you once a package you're using is updated to a new version. And it very much helps you maintain those versions across repos. But I think how I look at it is that if I don't have to extract it to a package right away, I would rather have it, built in as a mono repo or inside of my, platform code, in my apps code. And when it gets more stable and, I'm less of in a stage of constantly changing the components and customizing them. And I see that I have like a nice library of things, then I would extract it to an external package to avoid all of those pitfalls that you have using an external package. So in my opinion, I would build it out as I'm developing features. So I would create that library as I'm developing. And then when I feel comfortable, I would extract it to a package. And it really depends on, the way your app architecture is built. Because if you're working in a monorepo, you do have those tools, like I mentioned, like Yarn Workspaces or Lerna or NX to manage multiple packages within one repo. But if you're working across multiple repos, then of course you need a package and you can't get around that. But I think for as long as you can, I would flesh out the component library, not in a package, and then move it when it's more stable. That's sometimes you can't do that, but when you can, I recommend it because it's very hard. And I think back at Fiverr, we were very much at the notion that our component library would be, we would want to release it open source. So we have to have it in a package and, it's a component library. So it's got to be in a package from the get-go. And we got to a point where we discussed each component so much and we debated it so much because we had that notion that, it's going to be open source at some point. I don't think it ever got to that point, but that we spent so much time, debating the style guide of how the props would look like and how, the interface would look like. And it slowed down development a lot. So I would recommend not being locked in some notion, we're going to release it as open source in the future or something like that. Just work what you need right now with a vision for the future, but don't let that, hold you back and slow down development. You can always make changes. You can always extract it to a package. So I think that's a balanced approach to go about it.
So Dana, how did you decide which pieces to build for the pack or the component library? How did you prioritize, buttons versus drop downs versus inputs versus tables, et cetera, et cetera? Was it just whatever feature you were working on at the time that you needed components for, or was it more, kind of further thinking, well, we're definitely going to need X, Y, and Z, so we should build those regardless of if we need them right this second or not?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I've worked in places where, both approaches existed. Like at Fiverr, we set out to build the component library detached of the, decoupled from the development process itself. We had people spending their 20% time just building out this component library and, not necessarily if we're using that component right now or not, but, just fleshing that out, building more and more components as we go, which is, I think it's fine. But I think if you're more of a startup and you want to move fast, I would not recommend doing it that way, since it would require people to, spend a lot of time on that. And it does encourage, endless debate, the components and, we're going to use it like that. No, we're going to use it like that. We're going to need this customizable option. No, we're going to, in Hebrew, we call it hachana lemazgan. It's like building with it's from the construction world. It's like building with with the central air conditioner in mind, like making room for things in advance that you may not necessarily need, but you're so caught up in we might need this, we might need that, we might need this, that you're over engineering it, kind of over planning it. So in my approach, approach from like not as Fiverr did it. What I do right now is like I build it, as I said, as I develop, and I build it according to my current needs. So I spend less time thinking, yeah, this component might be used this way, and we might have a scenario where we would want it that way. I prefer to just build it for my current needs, for my current team's needs. And, if there is a scenario that comes up that we would need to expand upon it, that's fine. We can add, more to the component props and interface. And, it's of course easier to do when you're a small startup and you're not a bigger startup. But yeah, if you're a bigger startup, I would you probably have the resources to also, have people working on that component library. If you have that, have fun. But if you're a small startup, you're trying to move fast, which is most of the startups I work for, then I really think building it out and fleshing it out according to your needs while developing, it makes it like you don't waste time on unnecessarily over planning, over engineering. You actually get to a component that you use, and you actually allow that flexibility of changing the interface if it doesn't work for you anymore, or expanding on the interface. And I think making the decision of which components to put there, that's also something that, how do you decide that? Like which component should be in a component library and is reusable, and which component is too specific to be there. So from what I think, there's this atomic design methodology. If you're familiar with it, it actually breaks down components into several kind of levels. You have atoms, molecules, organisms, and then larger and larger pieces. And it kind of is a metaphor for, how small components slowly comprise bigger and bigger components that use those components, And I think those atoms, which are like the smallest building blocks, like a button, an input, it's just those things are very much, the basics of a reusable component library. And I also think that also molecules in that methodology, terminology, it's basically small components that use several atoms. So let's say you have like a product card, right? Like if it's an e-commerce website or something, you have like a card that has like a product image and a title and stuff like that, and a button, and a call to action like buy now. And so it's comprised of small atoms, right? It's comprised of an image and a button and a description and a title. So those could be reusable components of their own. But you also have that, product card, which is also a reusable component in your ecosystem, right? In an e-commerce site, it's very much a reusable component, a product, card. So I would also put that into the component library. It can be debated. At Fiverr, we very much try to keep it like very atomic, like the smallest component. I think it was more of that thinking that we might want to release it as open source. So we want to keep it like as a very much a UI library and not specific, to our needs. But I think having those components also reusable according to your app's ecosystem and your needs is better. Like I constantly use those molecules like user cards and app product cards across the website. And I think that should also be reusable in your component library. I mean, you eventually decide what building blocks look for you, right? For your app. It could be different across apps. It depends on like your world, your context. So if it feels like a building block that you're going to reuse a lot, and you see that you're actually reusing it, if you're actually seeing that you need to copy paste stuff, obviously that's a good sign that it should be like extracted and be generic enough to be reused. And I also think things like even, colors and typography and breakpoints and, stuff like that can also be extracted, not as components, but it can be put on that, package as things you can use because you have, typography sizes and, all those letter spacing stuff, that font weights and stuff that designers very much love. And you want to reuse that across the website. So that could also sit there. And, const for the colors definitely could be imported from that component library. Yeah.
So when it comes to the interface of the component, how strict are you? And I ask because when Twitter did UI redesign, they wrote a blog about how they saw that the buttons on the old UI were different in the application. And it's because the button component was too flexible and had so many custom props. So in the new one, they're basically more strict, even though it may in some cases make it less flexible. So how do you think about making a component API either strict or flexible? Because obviously each approach has its own merits and pros and cons.
Yeah, totally. It does depend on the kind of the design approach, I think, because I've worked at a startup that they were very strict. They were like, look, designer, you built it this way, and you need to think ahead of that this component is going to be reused. And we're not going to let you be flexible with that design. We're not going to let you customize, the margin and, the colors and stuff like that. The way you built it, this is how we're going to use it. And we're not even going to allow extending the styles or passing in class names because of that, the conceptual restriction that you want it to look exactly the same across the app. So I get that. I think especially with the larger organizations like Twitter or like Fiverr, it makes more sense. But I think in smaller startups, when you're building out the product and you need to kind of iterate frequently, and you might change the design, you might change things. It's very dynamic. So I think like if I would restrict myself and not allow those customizations, I think it would make development harder in the long run. I want to make it customizable and I want to make it, to allow myself to extend that component and according to the designer's needs. And I do think, like in my approach, the designer should be very much involved in building this component library out. And I think once you sit with the designer and you align with them on that concept of a component library that, some designers already do that. They work kind of in a, when they flesh out their designs, like the designer I'm currently working with, he creates a design and like in Figma, and under that, he just creates those unique components that he made with all their different states, like how it looks like disabled and empty and active and hover. So he's very much with that component library already in mind. But if they're not thinking that way, they might be more inclined to, create something new for each page that they built and not reuse existing components. So I would first, like, if you're starting out building that component library, I would very much from the start sit with the designer and make sure they understand what you're doing and make sure that they're on board and ask them to, when they create designs, keep that in mind, that they're creating components that you would be reusing, and encourage them to use those in the design. Like every new page they make, okay, well, we're going to have a component library. You're going to be able to look at that and choose from those components. And most designers that I know would be very much aligned on that notion, like a lot, again, already work in that, concept. But I think it's very important to align on that. And sometimes it can create frustrations because, they created a component a certain way, and then they designed a different page and they changed it a little bit. They kind of changed the component a little bit. And then you go to them, look, we built it a certain way where you originally designed it, and now you're changing it. You can't change it. And I think that point of being flexible versus rigid, like you could do, no, you can't change it because we already built it that way and that's it, versus, yeah, I can always extend the style object and, pass a class name in there and just customize it when we need it. And that's it. So I think it's kind of different approaches, and I'm not sure one is better than the other. I do like having the option to extend and, customize, but it's fine as long as you decide and align with the designer on what we're going for. And I think that the downside of restricting that design is, it limits the creative freedom and vision of the designer, because you're kind of limiting to what they're building once, and then like they could feel like they're limited to that design. So I do like giving them the freedom to, build upon that component and maybe adding more states and more things that they haven't thought about initially. Yeah. And I really think that also once you have, kind of a preview of the library, like in Storybook and stuff like that, you could definitely have them play with it and, interact with it. And you could even, build it out in Storybook first and just have them review it, have them fill it out. And once it's ready, it can go out into the app. But it could definitely serve as kind of a menu they can choose from of the components available.
When I first started taking computer science classes in college, I thought programming was just a joke. In fact, I changed my major over to engineering and started doing computer engineering and chip design. Then I found Ruby and I fell in love. I love Ruby. It was my first real programming language where I dove deep and really learned how to make software that makes a difference for other people. Since then, and the way that we got started with devchat.tv, we started a show called Ruby Rogues. It's currently in the 400s of episodes. We've talked to hundreds of people in the Ruby community, about the Ruby programming language, about Rails, and about what makes good programming. So if you're interested in Ruby Rogues, or you just want to hear a long series of experienced programmers talking about real problems, then go check out rubyrogues.com.
I was going to ask if you used Storybook. That was something that my team and I were considering when we were not using a component library. We ended up going with Ant Design, which has really good documentation and examples for our UXers of all the different components that are available to them. But before that, we were thinking of something like that so that UX could go through, find all the things that we'd already built, and hopefully reuse those in their designs to keep the consistency.
Yeah, I very much like Storybook. I think it serves as a very good kind of preview of your component library, especially if you're building out your own components. As you said, Design, for example, has really good documentation, really good, like their own kind of storybook and, examples of all the states of the component. And I think Storybook just does that very well. I think when you create all the states of the different of the components, like you have one component, like an input component, then you can do a story of that disabled, that pre-filled, that with max length and the character count and all those states. And it's very helpful, for example, for a new developer or new team to come over and see, okay, I need to build this page. Let's see which components already exist and if it behaves according to what the designer made. Oh, cool. There's then input. I'll just import that. And since Storybook allows you to, use add-ons to display like the props and the types, it creates a very easy kind of automatic documentation for the components. So I love that. And I also love using, the knobs and the actions. Like when you click something, you can note that there's a callback there and the structure of the object that gets returned. So I think Storybook is really a good solution for that. And I think if you have a component library, it's a very good idea to have Storybook or any other tool that creates that, component preview.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, we actually started using Storybook at my work, but then because we're trying to migrate an application to a new code base from Angular to React, and then also building new components as well, and then new features, we then found that it became a time issue where there was time to, look at the old code base and analyze what needs to change. Okay, once that's done, you've got a design, you've got your components, you build it, and then maybe after a month or so, or a few sprints, you need to then extend that component or maybe tweak it, like you're saying, because it's dynamic. But then at the same time, you've got work coming in as well. So we ended up saying, okay, just for now, we'll just use Figma because the designer has got all the stuff in Figma set up for all the different components. But from my experience, what tips do you have for actually being able to have a Storybook setup that's easy to use and maintain as well?
I think it really depends on your, development process. I do think spending that time to, adding that preview in Storybook is very beneficial, but I do understand that it does add time. As I said, it might feel like you're spending more time on, fleshing out the preview and the component instead of actually developing. It's not something that, I have the best answer for, like what you should exactly do. I think that it's kind of like adding tests to the components. You feel like it might be, it might slow you down, or it might be, a waste of time or whatever. But I think in the long run, it's very, very important when you're creating reusable components to have that aspect of, having a clear API for the component, having a clear preview, having tests that, kind of defend that structure that you built. And make sure it's stable. Yeah, I totally understand. We just added also, I just introduced Storybook myself to our component library, and it's not something that it's, you don't have to have it for developing. It's definitely not something that technically is required, but I do think that when you have time to add it, I think it gives a lot of benefits. So we do have some components that don't have stories at all, and I'm slowly adding it as I go. So it's not like all or nothing. It's just something that when you have time, you can add those stories, and you can add stories for the more stable component that you kind of reached a solid point there when you've mapped out all of the use cases, and you haven't changed those in a while. That button is kind of, I have that component ready. I can start introducing it to Storybook, have a story for it, have tests and stuff like that.
So that was another question that I had. Since I've not built a component library, how do you test something like that?
Yeah, so I would recommend, first of all, I love Jest. I think it's a great testing tool. And I think when you get to testing those components, which is, it could be a whole talk on itself on how to test components. But I think kind of the main functionality of the component is something you'd want to test. If it kind of formats, data in some way, definitely I would test that. You could also test like the UI behavior. Like you could use Enzyme to test that, the user interaction stays as you expected. Like when you click a button and a list item is added to the list, and just make sure that the integrity of the UI is how you would expect it. And sometimes that's very important. Like when you have payments or something like that, and you want to make sure that the PayPal button actually works, which actually happened at some point where a payment button did not work and it cost, never mind. So it's important to test those stuff on the UI side as well. So I think a combination of Jest and Enzyme is very good for those scenarios. And you also have Jest snapshots, which is good. I mean, it could be a headache when you're constantly updating the components. So if you don't know, a snapshot is you just take a kind of a virtual snapshot of the component. It just snaps the actual HTML output of the component. And when you make changes, it compares it to the previous snapshot. And it asks you, okay, it doesn't match the snapshot. Do you want to update it? So if someone touches the component and the tests automatically fail because you changed the snapshot, you can be very much aware, oh, I made a change there that, I need to update that snapshot. And it kind of gives you a point in time of how the component should look like. And, when you make a change, you might not be aware that you're actually, making a structural change in the component and changing, for example, some class name or something like that. And it may be, dependent on that structure. So snapshot, I think it's nice to have. I don't, see it as a necessity, but it's a cool feature. It's a cool feature to add to reusable components for sure.
Have you tried using Percy for testing visual components as well?
No, I have not.
So basically Percy is a tool which you can integrate with like your GitHub repo. And so how we use it is each time we push a change, we have Percy run that page. So let's say in our case, we've got a snapshot of the login page, reset password page, the dashboard. And basically what it does is when you add a new change to that code base, it will look at both the pages side by side and highlight the areas in the whole page that I've changed as well. So
is that like it compares actual screenshots?
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Nice.
Yeah, so
nice.
Things like margins, paddings get actually picked out because I found that when I use snapshots, you get to a case where you might tweak a really small thing in the component, which really shouldn't make it fail, but because it's a snapshot, it does. And then you end up updating them anyway. And after a while, you have a habit of clicking update on a snapshot, and it's really useful. So we've actually changed using Percy, and it's really, really good.
That sounds very useful.
Yeah.
I could have used that.
I think our team could still use that, honestly.
Yeah, no,
it sounds.
And the good thing as well is we have our designer look at the screenshot and tell us what needs to change. Because one issue we had was when we built a component, the designer might not see it until it's in production, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now what we do is when we're developing, we actually are also in close, talking to the designer and saying, okay, this is how it is so far. Any feedback on the page so far? And then after that, we go to the pull request stage, and Percy's got a snapshot of the page, so they can see that and say, okay, cool, I can see that in this area you've not done X, Y, and Z. And that means when we're in production or testing in staging, for example, there's less feedback because they've been involved in the process earlier on. So yeah, it's really good for that.
I love that because it really does involve the designer in the process and gives them a chance to review it before it's out there in production. Sometimes it's like a surprise for them. Oh, it's already there and it doesn't look like what I did. What the? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, I was just wondering, is it very difficult to get started with Percy? Like, how difficult was it to get it into your project?
Very easy. Very,
nice.
Very easy. Yeah, because it's literally in the code base. So we actually now use Percy and Cypress testing as well together.
Mm-hmm.
So if you use it on its own, you've got a file in your code base in which you basically have to outline the routes you're testing. So whenever it runs, like in our case, it's Circle CI. When you deploy the application, it basically runs Percy part of it and goes to each route and test it. But then now we've got it in Cypress as well. So I think there's a Cypress and Percy integration where you write your Cypress test, and as part of that test, it also runs Percy as well. So you get end-to-end testing and Percy as well on top of that. So it's really simple and quite easy to get in. Yeah.
Sweet.
Very good. Yeah, I think also adding Cypress, like it's not very specific to component libraries, but I think it's a very good tool for end-to-end testing, and the combination with Percy sounds like very good.
Yeah.
I'm going to adopt that.
Yeah. It's called the Cypress stack, I guess. You can call it that.
Nice.
Testing. Yeah. And one thing I talked to you about was you had an article on Medium which you titled "Becoming a Do-veloper,"
yes.
which basically had 12 steps for how to stand out as a developer in your company. Would you mind just going through that article and what made you want to write the article?
Yeah, no problem. So basically, I started writing it back when I was in Fiverr. It actually sat at my drafts for like years, but I kind of became more aware of that approach when I got to Fiverr because they very much encourage their employees to not just be focused on the task ahead, but be very much, in Israel, we call it big-headed, but in English, it means something else. But being, very, how do I say it? Thinking outside the box, kind of, and not just looking at your day-to-day jobs and your day-to-day tasks that you're given, but just, building proactively the course of your career and, just not being reactive to what features and projects you're being given and assigned to work on, but being very much kind of a leader within your organization, even if you're not a manager or something like that, you can always take on things that you find that you're passionate about and, become a more prominent developer within your company. So I think kind of when you're a junior developer, you're very much reactive. You're very much just, I got this Jira ticket. I'm going to do that the best I can. And that's it. Move on to the next. But when you become a bit more open-minded and more an ambitious view, then you need to start, being more proactive, looking at things that your team struggles with on day-to-day, like in the development process and thinking, okay, how could I improve that? How could I automate things for us? How could I introduce new technologies and new libraries that can improve stuff? How could I create, a UI for something that we do manually that's very hard, like managing A/B tests or rollouts for different users? So definitely why not add a dashboard for that? I think doing all those things can promote you from becoming very much a developer to a do-veloper. That's someone that's very prominent and someone that is pushing for their progress within the organization and in general. I think it really improves the perception of you within the organization and gives you more opportunities to be being presented to you because the organization starts and your managers, they start identifying that you're kind of going above, out of your comfort zone and not just being very focused on what you do, but you're also focused on the company's goals and you're helping other developers and, you're being very mindful of the whole roadmap and whole ecosystem and not just your little bubble. So I really think that those are very important points to, becoming a more prominent developer within an organization. And I'd love to talk about a little more about how you actually structure reusable components, because I think that's a point that is very important. Like how, when you have a component that's reusable, how is it different from a non-reusable component? Like what's actually different? So I really think you need to remember that you're building it for other developers as well in mind. So I think it needs to be abstracted as much as possible. So first of all, the language and naming, it should be generic. You try not to use things like very specific to your use case, but if you have a list of items, then just expect a prop called items and not just, something that's very specific. So yeah, the language is very, very much, an aspect of being generic. And I think having types that are not too specific and too complicated, very important. Also being flexible in those types, like you might expect a title to be a string, but it can also be a React node, right? It can be like something you might allow someone to put component there. So I think it's nice to allow that flexibility. And also I think it could be a useful thing to have kind of a style guide for the components and kind of a conceptual API consistency across the components. So if you have kind of callbacks and how you would name them and what to expect them to receive, I think it's also important. And I do recommend using TypeScript for those components. I do have a love-hate relationship with TypeScript. Mostly love. Sometimes I want to smash my computer to the wall, but mostly love. But I do think like for usable components, it's very beneficial because you get all those, those errors on compile time when you're using the component, if you're making changes, and it makes the interface is very clear of what you expect to receive and what you're returning. And if you don't want to use TypeScript, at least use prop types just to make sure that, the person that's going to use that component actually knows the interface and the props to use. And when you're using that, you're using prop types and you're using TypeScript, which is good, but I very much suggest using default props and setting default props for usable components. So it's very clear what the default state of the component is. And you can always change that. You can always switch the booleans and stuff like that, but you have a default state and it's very clear in that component. And very much important point is that those components should not depend on the store, right? So if you have store management, Mobex or Redux context, those components that are reusable, they should not be connected to the store in any way. You shouldn't have components that have inject or, observers. It's dumb components. It's not nice to call them dumb, but they're dumb. They're just display components that receive props and display the UI according to those props. So don't rely, store data for that. Just expect to get everything from the props and handle, the inner state with hooks. If you have like something that's inner functionality, like a accordion menu, when you have toggle lists that open and close, you can manage that within the component with, use state, but, don't expect to be connected to the store in any way. And I also recommend adding optional callbacks. So, when you have actions on the component, allow for callbacks to be passed in. It's very useful. Sometimes for like when you open and close a menu, sometimes you want to know if it's open or closed for any reason. You can also not add it at first and just iterate, as we said, but it's always a good thing to allow, places to hook into that you might need. And I also think display wise, reusable components should not have too much of a specific style to them. Like width wise, I would say the component should just take the width of the container. It does require some thinking of how it would be used, but I think since we want to allow the reusability across different scenarios, different layouts, I would not necessarily restrict the width of the component, and I would allow it to take the width of the container and just, have that concept in mind where you're just building something to be used within another component. So also according to your approach, like we talked about, if you're rigid or you're flexible, with extending and customizing those components. If you are more open to customizing, then I would definitely allow props like styles and class names, so you can hook into those divs or the component structure and actually customize it and pass custom styles. And I think if you're using also component that has, a basic HTML component like button or input, definitely extend that its natural type. Button has all sorts of and inputs they have on change and on focus and stuff like that. Definitely hook into that type and allow using that interface because, you would need that and people expect to be able to use that functionality. So I think those are the main points to keep in mind when you're building a component for reusability. So keep it generic, keep the language generic, make sure the types are very clear. The interface is very clear. Don't rely on store. Make sure you just rely on data passed from the props. And depending on your approach, allow customizability and the default types of the native components.
Cool. And I think to also add on that as well, I use a module called class names. I don't know if you heard of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you allow the component to accept a style, a class name, you can combine the component's class name and the prop class name as well. I use class names as well, and that's been really useful because before that, I would do the whole kind of ternary approach where I would say if this, then add this two together, and that got messy until I came across class, and it's really good for that kind of thing as well.
I totally agree. Class names is very useful for this case. I use it all the time. So basically, you could have the basic class name of the component, its basic style, and you allow passing a prop from outside as a class name, and then you can kind of override what you need, but you still get the original style of the component. That's especially, I haven't pointed out that I think using JSS is very good in reusable components. I think it really helps it become kind of a component on itself. And using that with class names, I think it creates a very good customizable component because you do get the default state of the component and you can pass in the style object that you need. And yeah, I think it's a very good point using class names for sure.
Cool. So I think we've covered quite a lot of ground today, actually. So are there any kind of last things you think we should know before we go on to picks?
I think also there are different approaches to how you would work on the component itself. Because when you create a reusable component, you could either work on it detached from your actual app. You could start working on it directly in Storybook, for example. So you have a very, isolated environment where you're just working on that component. Or you could work on it directly in the app. I kind of find with both approaches, I think in Fiverr, we very much did the development within Storybook just to keep it isolated, keep that reusability in mind, that it's not dependent on a certain page or a certain layout. It needs to work in various layouts. So I kind of like that approach because it kind of forces you to not rely on your app's, CSS necessarily or certain layouts CSS. Kind of gives you a more abstracted kind of feeling. I think that's it. We pretty much covered a lot.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. That's really good. That's really good stuff there.
Have you thought about learning to do native iOS development? Are you using Swift at work? Or maybe you've considered writing applications for macOS. We have a podcast that covers all of that called iFreaks. We have a new panel and a lot of exciting things to talk about, so come check us out at ifreakshow.com.
So let's go on to picks, and I'll start this time around. So the first pick is a website I came across today, actually. It's called diff.blog, and essentially it's created to keep track of all the blogs you have in tech. And it's because the guy that did it, I think you're saying that it's because on Medium, for example, the control of the blog is not actually yours. It's obviously on Medium's platform. And now they've removed the domains as well. So all the blogs say medium.com. So this website basically allows you to go on it, open up a pull request, I think, and you can add your blog to that website, and it keeps track of all the blogs in the industry. So like there's one from PayPal, from Stripe, from kind of like the more kind of typical tech blogs. So that's really good. And then secondly, my other pick today is all about using JS with no frameworks. And it's a repo called Vanilla Projects. And essentially what it is 20 projects written with no framework in mind. So just pure JS, and it's really good for being able to kind of try out your skills without using React or Angular or Vue. So yeah, that's my picks for today. Paige, what about you?
So my pick for today kind of goes with my pick from last time. My husband is in the process of vetting grills, all kinds of grills, smoker grills and pellet grills. And, he just wants a new grill. So one of the things that he has found and just ordered and is really excited to try out is a grill brush on Kickstarter called the World's Best Grill Brush. And what makes it different is that it's actually a sponge that you wet down and then rub against your grill grates instead of the wire bristle brushes, which can break off, or using tinfoil or something else to clean the grates. It's, you can wet it down, you can clean your grates, you can put the sponge in the dishwasher afterwards to wash it out again. And, it's supposed to be, the best grill brush that's ever been. We'll see. It looks like it is, though, because a lot of people really liked it. So I will be able to give you a report soon, but I'm going to go with it and say that the other people who have already commented how much they love it are a good starting point. So that's going to be my pick for today.
Is it pricey?
I don't think it is. I let me see. It looks like it's $25 for the early birds on Kickstarter, and then it was $35 after that. So yeah, it doesn't look like it's too pricey to start with.
Cool. Awesome. All right. And what about you, Diana? Any picks for today?
Do the picks need to be non-technical, or can
Anything,
it be?
Yeah, it can be tech.
Anything.
Non-tech.
So I think a very cool little one-page website that I found that actually I think Dan Abramov kind of retweeted. It's one-line layouts, and it's actually just CSS techniques that actually help you create very